In the isolated mountains of Appalachia, in McDowell County, West Virginia, lies a story as disturbing as it is revealing, a stark lesson on the dangers of extreme isolation and the consanguineous practices that can mark generations of a family. This is the account of Ezekiel Thornton, a self-proclaimed pastor who, under the veil of religion, perpetrated one of the most shocking cases of documented consanguineous union during the mid-20th century. The most consanguineous pastor in West Virginia's history forced his 3 nieces to marry him within the walls of his own church. For decades, the Thornton case remained hidden, protected by the formidable geographical isolation and a powerful code of silence that hovered over the small, rural communities of post-war West Virginia. It wasn't until 1978, when local authorities finally intervened after receiving complaints from worried neighbors, that the true extent of this familial plot began to surface. Ezekiel Thornton was born in 1911 on a small, rural property outside of Welsh, the largest city in McDowell County. The son of miners, he grew up in a community already characterized by its remoteness and by marriages between cousins, a practice that was relatively common in those remote hollows. Historical records indicate that his own parents, Isaac and Martha Thornton, were second-degree cousins, a union that, while questionable, was not unusual in the isolated regions of Appalachia during the early 20th century. At the age of 19, after a brief period laboring in the coal mines that dominated the local economy, Ezekiel claimed to have received a divine call. This epiphany occurred during a high fever brought on by pneumonia, which he had contracted in the dank depths of the mines. According to reports from older community members interviewed years later, this illness marked a radical transformation in his personality. The once quiet and reserved young miner emerged from his sickness with an unprecedented religious fervor and the unshakable conviction that he had been chosen to found his own church, which he named the Church of Purified Redemption. Established in 1935 in a small wooden cabin built on Thornton family land, the congregation initially consisted only of immediate family and a few curious neighbors. What few realized at the time, however, was how Ezekiel gradually began to shape his religious interpretations to justify practices that served his own interests. He spoke of blood purification and preserving a chosen lineage. Thomas Jenkins, one of the few community members who attended Thornton's early sermons before distancing himself, reported being alarmed by their direction. He said that God had shown him families should remain united not only in spirit but also in flesh, to preserve what he called a divine gift granted to his lineage, Jenkins recalled. The 1940s and 1950s were marked by the growing isolation of the Thornton property. Ezekiel constructed a high fence around his land and actively discouraged contact with outsiders. It was during this period that he consolidated his control over the lives of his 3 nieces, Mary, born 1932, Sarah, 1934, and Ruth, 1936, who were the daughters of his younger sister, Rebecca. After Rebecca died in 1947 from complications during childbirth, Ezekiel assumed the role of father, teacher, and pastor, controlling every aspect of the girls' lives. County school records confirm that none of the 3 attended the local school after their mother's death. Ezekiel told the rare visiting authority that he was providing a scripture-based education at home. The true horror began to unfold when Mary turned 18 in 1950. In a ceremony Ezekiel described as a divine union ordered by the Lord, he forced his eldest niece to marry him. The event was held in the property's small church with only family members present, all under the pastor's absolute influence. This pattern was repeated 2 years later with Sarah in 1952, and again in 1954 with Ruth, the youngest. Making the case even more disturbing was the fact that none of these marriages were officially recorded with the county. Instead, Ezekiel maintained what he called the Sacred Book of Unions, where he documented his own ceremonies. The consequences of these consanguineous unions manifested tragically and swiftly. Between 1951 and 1978, 12 births resulted from these relationships. Of these, 5 children died before the age of 5, presenting severe congenital malformations. Those who survived faced a host of health and developmental problems. Dr. William Harrison, a geneticist who later studied the case for the West Virginia Health Department, explained in his 1980 report, the descendants of this union had an extremely high coefficient of consanguinity. We are not just talking about relatives marrying, we are talking about multiple generations of consanguineous marriages, culminating in unions between an uncle and his nieces, who already carried common genes from previous generations. The children exhibited conditions typical of extreme inbreeding: severe cognitive deficits, congenital heart problems, syndactyly, webbed fingers, asymmetrical facial features, and compromised immune systems. James, the firstborn son of the union with Mary, born in 1951, had a severe form of polydactyly and an intellectual deficit that prevented him from developing language even into adulthood. Life on the property followed a rigid pattern dictated by Ezekiel. The three women and their children lived in precarious conditions, working a small subsistence farm. The isolation was nearly total. The children were never vaccinated, never attended school, and rarely left the property. Ezekiel justified this through sermons claiming the outside world was contaminated and that only his family was chosen to preserve the purity of their lineage. He enforced a strict regime of collective prayers 4 times a day and meted out severe physical punishments for any challenge to his authority. This situation persisted for nearly 3 decades, shielded by isolation and the reluctance of local authorities to interfere in family matters, a common attitude in rural West Virginia at the time. The turning point came in 1978 when one of the children, Daniel, born in 1962 from the union with Sarah, managed to escape. Despite his impaired development, the 16-year-old walked nearly 20 kilometers through the mountains to Welsh, where he conveyed enough details to the authorities to trigger an investigation. Sheriff Robert Anderson, who led the first official visit to the property in October 1978, described the scene as something from another century. The property was in deplorable condition, with deteriorated structures and evident signs of extreme poverty. The children, many clearly displaying physical deformities, seemed scared and malnourished. Ezekiel, then 67, maintained absolute control through what I can only describe as a combination of religious fervor and physical intimidation. The case presented a legal dilemma, as West Virginia had no specific laws in 1978 addressing consanguineous marriages within isolated religious contexts. However, evidence of child neglect, forced isolation, and inadequate living conditions was sufficient for McDowell County Social Services to obtain a court order to remove the children. 7 children, ranging in age from 3 to 16, were taken into state care. The psychological impact on Mary, Sarah, and Ruth was profound. Decades of isolation and indoctrination had created a deep conditioning, making it difficult for them to conceive of any other life. Dr. Eleanor Montgomery, the psychologist who worked with them, documented a classic case of Stockholm Syndrome combined with extreme religious indoctrination. Patients showed a deeply rooted emotional dependence on their captor, an inability to recognize the abusive nature of their situation, and strong initial resistance to any external intervention, she noted. The 3 sisters initially resisted being separated from Ezekiel, genuinely believing they were fulfilling a divine destiny. Detailed medical examinations of the children revealed the full impact of the extreme consanguinity. Dr. Robert Collins, the evaluating pediatrician, documented not only obvious physical malformations but also severe immunological deficiencies, heart problems, neurological developmental delays, and a predisposition to epilepsy. Dr. Harrison's genetic analysis estimated the children's coefficient of inbreeding to be between 20% and 25%, exceptionally high compared to the 6% seen in marriages between first cousins. This high degree of genetic kinship caused the expression of multiple deleterious recessive genes, effectively materializing the accumulated genetic burden of generations. Ezekiel Thornton's trial began in March 1979. The 68-year-old remained unyielding, stating at one point, "What you call wrong, I call sacred. What you call disease, I call the mark of divine choice." Forensic psychiatrists diagnosed him with a combination of delusional disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. He was found guilty of multiple counts of child neglect, forced isolation, and exploitation of vulnerable dependents and was sentenced to 25 years in prison. He died in state custody in 1984 at the age of 73, having never expressed remorse. For the nieces and their children, the path to recovery was long and complex. The 3 sisters underwent extensive psychological rehabilitation, literally learning how to live in the modern world. Ruth, the youngest, adapted more readily, eventually obtaining a basic education. The children faced even greater challenges due to their health problems, requiring constant medical care and specialized education. Daniel, whose escape had catalyzed the intervention, became a symbol of resilience, though he lived with chronic health issues. The genetic impact extended to the next generation. Even when the survivors had children with unrelated partners, they passed on a compromised genetic burden, leading to a higher incidence of autoimmune diseases and other conditions. The Thornton case had a significant policy impact, leading West Virginia to revise its child protection laws in 1981 and establish better protocols for monitoring isolated communities. The former Thornton property was demolished in 1992, and a small grove of trees was planted as a silent memorial. A discreet plaque installed in 2005 bears the inscription, "In memory of those whose voices were silenced. May their story teach us vigilance against the isolation that allows suffering to remain hidden." The medical, psychological, and genetic records of the Thornton case have since become important educational tools, used in universities and training programs to illustrate the devastating biological effects of extreme consanguinity and the social dangers of unchecked isolation. The story stands as a dark reminder of how religious manipulation and geographical seclusion can foster horrific abuse, but also as a testament to the human resilience that can, even against overwhelming odds, break the cycle and seek the light. The Thornton story did not end with the trial, nor with the demolition of the family property. Instead, its legacy seeped into the cultural fabric of West Virginia, becoming a whispered legend in McDowell County and a subject of fascination for researchers across the United States. While Ezekiel himself perished behind prison walls in 1984, the echoes of his deeds continued to reverberate, leaving behind scars that could not easily be erased. In the years following the intervention, journalists descended on the Appalachian Mountains, eager to document what they saw as proof of America's forgotten people. Sensational headlines often painted the Thorntons as the embodiment of Appalachian decay, ignoring the broader economic struggles and social isolation that had shaped their lives. Local residents, many of whom already felt stigmatized by stereotypes of ignorance and backwardness, resented the national attention. To them, Ezekiel was a grotesque outlier, not a representative of their culture. Still, the case deepened an enduring tension between insiders determined to protect their dignity and outsiders determined to expose the darkness within the hills. The medical community, however, approached the Thornton case with a different lens. Doctors and geneticists who studied the surviving children spoke of the tragedy not only as a moral failure but also as a biological lesson etched into flesh and blood. Their research showed how the compounded weight of generations of cousin marriages, magnified by the uncle-niece unions orchestrated by Ezekiel, brought recessive genes to the surface in catastrophic ways. Textbooks on human genetics soon included the Thornton children in discussions of the dangers of close consanguinity, turning private suffering into public knowledge. Psychologists, too, were captivated by the case. The three sisters, Mary, Sarah, and Ruth, offered a chilling portrait of indoctrination so complete that they initially resisted freedom itself. Experts studying their rehabilitation noted how decades of spiritual manipulation had created a paradoxical bond between captive and captor. For these women, Ezekiel was not just an abuser, he was also father, husband, prophet, and judge. Breaking free from that labyrinth of identities required years of therapy and patient guidance. Their recovery became a case study in the long-term effects of religiously framed coercion, proof of how doctrine can be weaponized to dismantle the will of vulnerable individuals. The broader community impact was equally profound. Churches across West Virginia found themselves under new scrutiny as outsiders began to question how faith could be distorted to enable exploitation. While most pastors condemned Ezekiel's practices as heresy, they nonetheless faced uncomfortable questions about the unchecked authority religious leaders often held in remote areas. Some congregations responded by instituting internal accountability measures, others bristled at what they saw as outside interference. The Thornton case, in this way, stirred a statewide conversation about the delicate balance between religious freedom and state responsibility. For the children, however, these debates were distant. Their daily lives in foster care or institutional settings were marked by medical appointments, learning to read and write for the first time, and struggling to interact with peers who had grown up in a vastly different world. Many of them bore visible reminders of their origins: physical deformities, delayed speech, and chronic illness. But what weighed heaviest were the invisible burdens: shame, confusion, and the persistent feeling of being other. Teachers and social workers who worked with the Thornton children later described them as both fragile and resilient, traumatized survivors who nonetheless clung to small victories, whether it was completing a math problem or learning to ride a bicycle. The story also reshaped West Virginia's legal landscape. Prior to 1978, child neglect laws were vague, often leaving space for abusers to claim parental or religious authority. The Thornton revelations forced lawmakers to confront the inadequacy of existing protections. By 1981, new child welfare protocols gave agencies more power to intervene in cases of prolonged isolation and unusual family arrangements. While these reforms could not undo the past, they stood as a safeguard against future horrors hidden in the mountain's shadows. Ezekiel himself never wavered, even as his health declined in prison. Fellow inmates recalled that he continued to preach, insisting he was a chosen vessel misunderstood by the outside world. To the end, he framed his punishment as persecution rather than justice. His death in 1984 closed one chapter but did little to quiet the unease he had sown. In time, the Thornton property itself was leveled, erasing the physical reminder of his dominion. Yet the memory lived on in folklore and academic study alike. Locals whispered about ghostly figures seen wandering the grove where the church once stood, while scholars cited the case in conferences as a grim warning of what unchecked isolation could unleash. Some even argued that the Thornton saga should be taught alongside accounts of cults and closed societies around the globe, as an American variation of a universal danger. Above all, the Thornton legacy forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. It reminds us that abuse often thrives not in bustling cities but in the hidden corners of rural life, where silence and distance can shield unspeakable acts. It warns us that faith, when stripped of accountability, can be twisted into a justification for cruelty. And it teaches us that vigilance must extend even into the most secluded valleys, because suffering, once ignored, only festers deeper. Yet within this darkness, there is also resilience. Daniel's flight through the mountains in 1978 remains a symbol of courage against impossible odds. His desperate journey was not just an act of survival, it was the spark that shattered decades of secrecy, opening the door for others to be freed. His act, fragile as it was, proved that even under the weight of fear, the human spirit can still reach for freedom. The Thornton saga is thus both a warning and a testament, a warning about what isolation and unchecked power can create, and a testament to the endurance of those who survived it. It lingers in history not as a mere curiosity but as a lesson we cannot afford to forget. If you've followed this story, I ask you to leave the phrase "I watched" here in the comments below. It helps me connect with you and know who truly appreciates the deep, researched stories we bring to light on this channel. Your voice is crucial. It ensures that cases like this are not forgotten and that we can continue to uncover the truth society needs to confront. If this report has impacted you, please be sure to like this video and share it with others. By subscribing to the channel, you support our mission to explore more historical cases that reveal the darker corners of history we must learn from.